What used to be the case, and I know Lefty Kreh really advocated this, was that if you cast your fly rod with your dominant hand, when you hooked a fish, you switched that rod over to your non-dominant hand to reel with your dominant hand.
Hey everyone, this is John Kolb and Dave Rothrock with The Ranting Angler. This video is part of our fly fishing gear series. This video will be covering fly reels after you buy a fly rod. So I just picked my fly rod, and what's the first thing I want to consider when I'm picking a reel to match that fly rod?
The reels today are marketed by what line weight they are going to be holding. It's with regard to that capacity for a particular line weight. And you're looking at not only the line weight, you're also looking at the backing capacity as well. So for example, some of the reels will hold 50 yards of backing and let's say a 5-weight line. Now what I have here is I've got a few examples, and this reel is actually marked for 7/8, which means it's going to hold either a 7-weight or an 8-weight line. Now that's also then going to be with so much backing, and it's usually between 50 and 100 yards. More than likely it would be 100 yards for this one. One of the things you need to keep in mind is it will hold that if you're fishing or putting on a weight forward line. If you're talking about a double taper, then backing capacity is going to be reduced. And the reason for that is there's going to be a lot more thick line going on this reel with regard to a double taper line than there would be with a weight forward line. But then too, what you're looking at is there are arbor sizes. Now, I go back here, this is actually showing the extremes in that this reel is actually a small reel. It's for a 3/4 line. It's also a large arbor. Now, this, on the other hand, while it's a 7/8 reel, it's a standard arbor or small arbor. And the arbor is actually the spindle right there in the middle that the line is going to be wound on. Now, when you think about winding line on a large arbor reel, and by the way, there are also mid-arbor reels out there on the market, but when you're talking about a large arbor reel, you're talking about a much larger diameter that line starts being wound on. Now, when we do that, we think about two things. We think about the fact that there's not as much curl when that line is now going to be taken off the reel. And fly lines all have memory, some more so than others. But when you're talking about a standard arbor reel, you're talking about really putting that line on a much small diameter base, which means then too, when you take that line off, especially when you get down close to the end, you're going to have a lot of line coil. So that's something to consider. Now, the other thing is, and it's not so much relevant as it was in years gone by, generally you're going to have more line capacity on a standard arbor reel. When you're talking about a large arbor reel, this one happens to be a 5 or 6 weight reel, so obviously it has more line capacity. You're talking about it's not going to hold as much line for the total diameter of that reel. And that's something to consider. You're going to find these standard arbor reels much more popular with regard to the folks that are fishing fiberglass rods or the softer rods. And that obviously means that the factors that come into play with regard to what you're going to experience with your line being on a reel like this is not going to be that significant to make a difference in reel choice. I, of course, prefer a large arbor reel. The line not only goes on a much larger diameter base, but it also then spreads out a little bit wider, because if you were to look at these reels head on, the standard arbor reel is much narrower, whereas the wide arbor reel or large arbor reel is much wider. That to me makes a big difference. The other thing is, and this is important to some, when you have line that's coming off that reel, Some people say a drag is not that important. I have a tendency to place more importance on a drag, and that being the case, yes, it's more important in my decision-making process. When you take line off of a standard arbor reel, you're going to find that it actually increases the drag the further on down you get. So that being the case with a large arbor reel, you don't see that significant difference from when there's only a little bit line on the reel and it's being taken off and all of a sudden there's very little line on the reel. Not going to be a lot of difference in the drag with regard to what you started out with and what you have later on with only a little bit of fly line left on that reel. And that can really come into play, especially when you have a fish take a long run. You start out with light drag, and the further that fish goes with a standard arbor, and all of a sudden that drag is increased, and now you've not only got the weight of the fly line out of the rod tip, impacting all that is coming into play with regard to that lighter tippet out there by that fly, you've also got a drag that's really tightening down as the line being taken off that reel becomes greater and greater in length. Reel mass weight is another factor to consider. When I have a reel that weighs 5 ounces versus a reel that weighs about 4 or even 3.8 ounces, and especially if I'm nymphing and I'm holding my arm out like this, some people say not to do that. I'm telling you it's an advantage at times. But the point is, I'm going to really experience more fatigue the longer I do this with that heavier reel. So I'm one of the people that I look at how much that reel weighs with regard to how much weight I'm actually going to be holding in my hand, or it's going to be hanging off my rod. Now, along with that, you got to remember that we have both machined aluminum reels and cast reels. There was a day that we said the machined aluminum reel is a much better reel. Today, I'm not so sure that that would really be a factor. What we have, though, is when you have a machined aluminum reel that's very lightweight, a reduction in its durability. Drop one of them accidentally on a rock, and you're going to find that there's going to be significant damage potential. You may or may not have that with a cast reel. Cast reels can break, there's no question about that, but cast reels, for the most part, I believe, are actually more durable. So that may be something to take into consideration. The other thing, too, is cast reels have a tendency to be less expensive than machined aluminum reels. So once you start considering all of those factors, that may come into someone's decision-making process as to what reel to buy. But then we've got one other factor to consider, and that's price. And we've got prices ranging anywhere from under $100, they're going to be cast reels, to well over $400. In fact, I can think of 2 companies today that the average reel that they sell is somewhere in the ballpark of $450 on up. Now, they're finely machined reels, there's no question about it. They're actually precision instruments. The drags are all enclosed on most of our reels today, whether it be the less expensive or the more expensive. In fact, there's one company out there uses the same drag system on their inexpensive reels that they use on their most expensive reels. But being enclosed, it's not going to then allow dirt and grit to get inside there and cause some issues that we've had in the past with drag systems that actually are exposed and allow that to get in and really cause some issues. But then there's the other factor, and that is, what reel's prettier for you than another reel? And believe me, there's a lot of beautiful reels out in the market. And that is something that not necessarily appeals to me as a fly fisher, but it seems to appeal to others. So there are a pile of factors for you to consider right there.
The first reel that I had purchased on my own, I made a mistake. I thought, I'm right-handed, so I need a right-handed retrieval reel. Bought it online, got it, went to put it on my fly rod, and I'm like, no, this isn't right. I want to reel it with my left hand. So keep that in mind when buying a rod, that right hand means you're actually using your right hand to reel it in. Left hand retrieval means that you would use your left hand, which if I'm casting right-handed, I want a left hand my preference is to reel with my left hand.
You know, you say that, John, but let's go back in time to days gone by when, in reality, your reel that you bought would have been appropriate for a right-hander. What used to be the case, and I know Lefty Cray really advocated this, was that if you cast your fly rod with your dominant hand, when you hooked a fish, you switched that rod over to your non-dominant hand to reel with your dominant hand because you could reel faster. Now, I'm here to tell you that while I've fished both ways, I've hooked some really large fish where I'm left-handed and I typically use a right-hand wind reel. I was given a left-hand wind reel to fish. I had to switch, and I didn't have the strength in my non-dominant hand to really play that fish the way I should have. So there are times when that old traditional way of doing things can actually, to me, compromise a person's ability to play and land a big fish. Today, of course, it's just the opposite. We hook a fish, we continue fighting that fish with the rod in our dominant hand, and we reel with our non-dominant hand. And that's certainly the way I prefer to fish.
Now, what about care and maintenance of a fly reel, or the things that I should be doing and others to make sure that reel lasts?
You want to make sure that you lubricate your reel periodically. Your reel may let you know when it's time, but there's always the preventive maintenance position, and I would advocate for that. So yeah, make sure that your reel is lubed well. Every once in a while, just check it and apply whatever you need to apply. You can find reel lube pretty much anywhere. You know, it's a matter of a little dab will do you, and that's what you want to do. The other thing too is, obviously, if you drop your reel into the stream, especially if it goes down into you know, silt and what have you, yeah, you want to make sure it's cleaned, because that grit can get, for example, if you have a spool that actually fits inside a frame, then that grit can get in between the frame and the spool. So you want to get that out and just, you know, make sure it's clean. That's pretty much what it boils down to. Yep. Now, saltwater maintenance is a different issue.
So that covers it for reels. Please make sure you are subscribed. That will help the channel out substantially. Check out the video we did on fly rods, and then our next video is going to be on fly lines. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.